Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to this Peak Prosperity podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson. Water. Water is essential to life, and it's really essential to our modern way of life. And food is often grown very far away, trucked and shipped across the world, in many cases from places with water to those without. Food imports are really water imports in a lot of cases. Aquifers, that groundwater, those aquifers are being drained across the globe at a far faster rate than they can replenish in many cases. And so this is a topic that we spend some time examining at Peak Prosperity because it's so vital, and yet it often gets relatively little press and even less concrete policy responses. Closer to home, for several years running, huge swaths of the American West, and especially the Southwest, has been under drought conditions ranging from moderate to exceptional. And California has had the worst experience of any state so far. To talk with us about the drought, its impacts, our possible responses is Doug Parker, the director of the California Institute for Water Resources and strategic initiative leader for the UC Agricultural and Natural Resources Water Quality, Quantity, and Security Strategic Initiative. He coordinates water-related research, extension, and education efforts across the 10 University of California campuses, the UC system, and other academic institutions within California. And then prior to joining the University of California, Doug worked on water quality issues related to the Chesapeake Bay while at the University of Maryland. Welcome, Doug.
Howdy, welcome. Thank you.
Well, let's start with the fact that California's been getting a lot of needed rain lately. Is the drought over?
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's raining, and I really appreciate the rain. I've been one of those people out walking around and it getting all wet with my umbrella under my arm. But we need about 150% of normal rainfall in order to get out of this drought. So I think we'll be happy if we get 100%. I think, the way I sort of look at it is, at the beginning of a ball game here, our wet, rainy season goes from November through March. So we've had a very successful beginning of the season, and if it keeps up, it'll be a wonderful year. But we have had seasons where, things just drop off all of a sudden, and then we go back into having drought problems.
Right. So the drought has been fairly exceptional. How long has it been running?
So we're now entering the fourth year of drought. Water years run from October through September, so this is just sort of, just the beginning part of the fourth year. And the long-term average, we've actually been below average for about 8 years now.
8 years. And so one of the responses we've seen is a lot of newspapers have printed the pictures because they make good pictures, is all the wells being drilled, some of them 1,000 feet deep, $300,000 wells just to get at a little bit of groundwater. Has the recent rain, do you think, is it enough to get people to turn back to surface water at this point?
No, I don't think so. I think many people who rely on our large surface water delivery systems are still going to be facing reduced deliveries this year unless it really does keep raining solidly through March. So I think that there's going to be a need for groundwater to be pumped, and some people just pump groundwater all the time anyway because they don't have surface water. It's really a matter of how much groundwater and when. How do we spread that groundwater pumping out properly over sort of the long haul of the 10-year kind of average? The
long haul. So let's talk about groundwater quickly. So when we mention groundwater, it's the same as saying an aquifer. There's water, it's underground. We're going to pump it out as compared to something that might come from a stream, a lake, an impoundment, something on the surface. So that groundwater in California, how is that groundwater managed?
Well, California was the last state in the West to actually pass any kind of groundwater legislation to manage it. So up until recently, there really was no management. It was anybody who owned land could drill a well and use the water. In some areas when that started to become problematic, mostly near the coast, the courts could sometimes step in and adjudicate the basin, allocate that groundwater reserve. But we did just this year pass a groundwater legislation that was signed by our governor in September that requires for sustainable groundwater management agencies to be created that will then create sustainable groundwater management plans, and then they will implement those plans. So we're still talking long haul full implementation of those plans is not until something close to 2040.
So I assume to develop a plan, at a minimum, a couple of things you might need would be to understand the nature of the groundwater resource and match that against the pumping. First, how many groundwater basins are there in California? And second, have they all been mapped? Do we understand them?
Yeah, so, well, there are maps of most of the basins. They're not all well understood. There's over 200 basin and sub-basins for groundwater in California, so it's quite complex. Some of those basins are very well understood. They've been being looked at by scientists or consultants or local agencies. So in some basins, we have a very good idea of what the groundwater recharge rates are and who's using groundwater. But in other basins, we have very little information other than just sort of a boundary on them.
And so those basins, I presume those, when we say mapped, I mean they would have to be analyzed, understood, and then the plan would have to be matched against what we know about the recharge rates, I guess would be the most important thing.
Yeah, so essentially what we really need to be able to do is we need to know what the recharge rates are and where that recharge is coming from, because it's different in different parts of the basin depending on soil types. You know, a sandier soil will recharge quicker than a heavier clay soil. So you have to know the soils, you have to know where the water is and where that recharge is coming from. And when we talk about groundwater management planning and doing sustainable plans, it's not just looking at natural recharge, it's also asking the question of can we increase that recharge in some way. So it's both a supply and a demand management aspect when you're trying to get groundwater use into a sustainable situation.
Well, Doug, how would you increase the recharge rate? How would you do that?
Yeah, so there's a few things that you can do. One is you can actually build groundwater recharge ponds. So you can scoop out an area, and then if you've got excess surface water, say from one of these storm events coming through right now, you can try to capture that and hold it in the pond and let it recharge down into the groundwater. And you can recharge at rates of 6 or so inches a day of water into groundwater basins if you have the right soils and stuff. Another way we're looking at it, and we actually just started doing some studies on this at the university, is to look at using fallowed or other farmland that in the wintertime may not be growing crops, and can we kind of flood those lands for some period of time to put more groundwater down into the basin.
Well, that's fascinating. So in one of the things that I read about with the groundwater pumping, particularly in certain parts of the Central Valley, it had been overpumped so much that land subsidence occurred, and so the land sank. And presumably when it's sinking, it's one of the things that I was reading about is that it can, in some cases, depending on the type of underground terrain we've got, that once it sinks, it collapses interstitial spaces or whatever crevices exist, and then water can't get back in there. Is that what you're seeing in some cases?
Yeah, we are seeing that in some areas. It is interesting. You know, you think about the soil, think of a sandy soil, and if it's full of water, there's water in the pore spaces sort of between the grains of sand. And right, if you take all of that water out, then the air will leave and the sand will compress down. And then it's very difficult or impossible in some cases to get water back into those systems. So subsidence is pretty, has a lot of different impacts. It impacts our infrastructure too. It leads to cracks in roadways. It leads to having to work on a lot of different infrastructure, canals and stuff. You know, these things are built at certain angles to get that water to flow downhill, and if you've got some side of the canal collapsing down versus another, you've got to redo a lot of that work. So there's that, plus the fact just the loss of that available space for storage is important to consider.
So I assume that's all part of a plan. You would want to make sure that you're not getting the subsidence as part of whatever you're up to. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think any sustainable groundwater management plan is going to be looking at how do I balance supply and demand in the long run in some kind of a 10-year time frame, and how do I manage this system so that I can get the most out of it? I mean, that's valuable storage down there underground, so we do need to manage for it. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that groundwater is a really good resource during droughts. So it's not a situation where you'd want to pump a sustainable recharge rate every year. What you want is a long-term average so that when you have a drought, you can draw on that groundwater and let it draw down a little bit. But the point being is that, of course, when the drought is over and you've got plenty of excess surface water, you need to be putting it back. You know, it's like refilling the bank account.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like pension management, although I see those get managed poorly as well. So when there's good years and the stock market returns, the people running the pension funds will often say, "Oh, we don't have to put as much money into these. Look how the great returns." And then of course you have the lean years, which are your droughts, and then they go, "Oh yeah, we should have been putting more in." So it sounds like the same thing, that during when you got plenty of surface water, you still need to be thinking about your long-term situation.
Yeah, you really do, and you really need to manage the two together. You don't want to just manage surface water or just manage groundwater. You want to manage them together so that you create a nice, sustainable outcome in the long run. Because really, what's most painful about things like droughts is the swings that happen. You've got a lot of water one year and a little water another year, and so farmers have to cut back on irrigation and land planting. Things like that. So if you can smooth that out to the best possible, you're obviously going to be better off.
Oh, absolutely. So, but let's talk about the long term, maybe the really long term. I just hinted at it in the opening, which is around this idea of a mega drought. I've been reading plenty of accounts by some people who look back through the very long term whatever we're going to call that, archaeo record, looking back through whatever rainfall records we can piece back together from tree rings and whatnot, looking back, seen that California and other parts of the Southwest have gone through typically very long periodic episodes of what we would call a mega drought, lasting 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years, depending on which one we're talking about. Is that part of the thinking now, that are there patterns that you're seeing that suggest that a mega drought is potentially brewing here?
I think that what we're seeing is a drought that we haven't seen in sort of recorded history. And so we're looking at other models and looking at how that impacts them. And looking back at those tree ring data and stuff, we do see that, right, we have had periods in the state where we've had 10-year droughts, 20-year droughts, even 100-year droughts. And, even those 100-year droughts may be mixed in with a little bit of rainfall now and again, of course. I mean, it's not just completely dry for 100 years. We still do get some winter. But we are starting to look at that kind of stuff and asking questions of what can we be thinking in the long run if we do face those types of situations. We learned a lot from the millennial drought in Australia, and we're trying to kind of look at those lessons here to see how we can best manage our water resources.
Well, what were some of the best lessons that came from the Australia experience?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons that we've learned is that you need a good portfolio of water supply in order to get through these situations. So it's not just being dependent on one river or one groundwater source, but having communities that have access to 2 or 3 different water sources. So, for instance, Southern California gets water from Northern California. They also get water from Eastern California, and they get water from the Colorado River Basin, as well as their local water supplies. So they've actually felt the drought a little less than other parts of the state because the Colorado River Basin isn't in such a drought situation. So having multiple sources of water, adding desalination or recycling water, sewage effluent and stuff, and treating that and recycling it in ways are all important to have this whole portfolio of things that allow us to get through the harder times when there's drought in specific areas.
So in terms of the kinds of things that we probably should do just to have a comprehensive approach to sustainable water, regardless of whether there's a drought or not, where are we in that process? Is there a lot of portfolio diversification that needs to happen still, a lot of infrastructure to build out, or is this a matter of lining up what we already have and just using it better?
I think it's definitely a bit of both. We have an infrastructure system that was designed in the 50s and the 60s for a certain population and a certain land base out there in California. Things have obviously changed a lot, and one of the other things that's changed a lot is our weather patterns. So we do need to look at our infrastructure and say, how do we increase the flexibility of our infrastructure? How do we move water not just north-south, but also east-west, or maybe even from south to north? Do we have the infrastructure available to do that? And how do we, like I mentioned, recycle more? So there's definitely a need for more infrastructure, but we're also seeing a need for more use of management technologies. So when we manage our reservoirs for flood events, we have these curves that are based on historical rainfall that tell us that, we need to have the reservoir down to a certain level by March in case there's a big rainstorm in late March. And so sometimes we're dumping water in anticipation of potential rainstorms that then don't materialize. So to the extent that we can use more satellite, better weather forecasting better tools to predict runoff coming from storms, then we can manage those reservoirs and the whole system in a better way in order to sort of maximize water output.
And when you say we, is there a central agency that's overseeing this at this point, or are there multiple agencies that have to be coordinated?
Multiple agencies. So we've got two big players in California. One is the federal government, which runs the Central Valley Project, and the other is the state government, which runs the State Water Project. Those two probably account for the majority of water in California. Probably 60% maybe through all of them. I'm not really quite sure of that number, but that'd be a reasonable guess. And then we've got a lot of local agencies that have their own water supplies. So San Francisco has its own water supply. The East Bay, Oakland area, that has its own water supply. Los Angeles has its own water. So and then in the agricultural communities, they also have some. So it's a mix of local, federal, and state that all have to be coordinated.
And if it turns out that there is this idea of a mega drought, I presume their use patterns might have to change as well. And I'm sure this is a sensitive topic, so do with it what you can. But clearly, farming uses a lot of water. And when I see beautiful pictures of celery being grown in the Central Valley, it's just this beautiful green against this very, very desert sort of a hilly background. So we're growing stuff in many cases in places where there's not a whole lot of water. Is there any, where are we in the discussion cycle of saying that possibly there's some activities that don't make sense in some areas and we might have to find other ways of using water?
Yeah, I think that we really need to look at our water rights system. We have a system based on mostly historical land use and historical water use. And creating more flexibility in that system to allow trading of water and movement of water between uses would be very beneficial for that. I don't see that we're really going to be in the position where we tell people what they do or don't grow. We don't tell companies what to do and not to do with the inputs they use in their production processes. We may limit, their environmental or externalities, things like that, and that's certainly reasonable to do. But the more top-down approach probably wouldn't work too well. But being able to have more of a water market would make sense, because if somebody's using water for a low-valued use, but they could sell it to somebody else for a higher valued use, markets generally tend to help us, find the best and optimal path for those types of things.
Well, let's talk about those water rights for a minute. If everybody used all of their water rights fully, does that match 100% of available water, or are the claims larger than the available supply at this point?
Yeah, so the most recent studies I've seen have shown that the claims are quite a bit larger than the available long-term supply in the state. So there may be a reckoning at some point where we do need to look at the full water rights system. And maybe, I'm not saying reallocate, but, there may have to be some scaling or something that brings it into balance. There are some water rights that just haven't been used in a long time, so those would also need to be looked at. But the water rights situation is obviously very touchy, because their water right is a value, and often it's tied to the land. So a lot of people who own land, that land has a water right. And when they sell the land, the water right goes with the land. So if you were to just take it away, what you're really doing is devaluing the land, and that leads to a lot of disruption. So it needs to be done in a sensitive manner that sort of accounts for the potential economic impacts.
Well, sure, yeah. The drought just starts to expose the cracks in the system, I guess, and then we have to confront it. So as you look around in terms of best practices of water management, like if you went across the globe, who's doing it best, do you think?
Well, certainly the leaders in water management, there's sort of an urban and ag side to that. On the agricultural side, I'd say the leaders in water management are Israel, Australia, and California, if you look across the globe. And that makes sense. Those are all Mediterranean climates and places where there are water shortages. On the urban side of it, the leaders in water management, Singapore is a really big innovator in water management across the globe. California, again, Orange County is one of the leading areas in California on that. Not everywhere in California, I would say, is a leader in urban water management, but Orange County is certainly one of the better ones here.
And what are the things that makes an urban water manager float to the top of that list?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to diversifying supply and building resilience into the system. Desalination costs have come way down in the last 15 years through new technologies, and hopefully they'll continue to come down. The biggest cost for desal is the energy use, and so there's some issues there. And then also recycling of urban wastewater is a big deal. And so in Singapore, they treat the urban wastewater to a completely pure level where they're able to just put it back into the water system. Orange County also treats it to that level as well, although they don't put it right back into the system. They use it to recharge groundwater and then pull it out later on.
All right, so let's talk about desal for a minute, because people do pin a lot of hopes on that. So you say that the energy costs principally have gone down a lot in the last 15 years. Hopefully those continue to go down. How much energy does it take to desalinate water at this point in time with a new plant?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I could comment on the exact amount of energy.
Uh-huh.
I just know that the amount of energy used has probably come down by half in the last 15 years through new membrane technologies and stuff. But it's still fairly energy intensive. I mean, if you look at the cost of producing desal water, it's quite a bit more expensive than being able to access groundwater or fresh surface waters. And most of that cost is just driven by the energy.
Yeah, and this is, I assume it's still mostly electrical energy we're talking about, because it's probably just for pressure pumps creating pressure, right?
Yes, it's mostly you have to push the water through the membrane, so you have this pump energy that you need in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, so going from a higher concentration to a lower is always nature doesn't like that. So, but I've been reading some great things potentially. They're very exciting developments in graphene as a membrane technology potentially, and so it's we're reading more and more and more about that. But still, it does take energy to create that. So we'd much rather use nature's bounty if we can, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. So how long before we'll know if California's got that 150%? Do you think you think we're probably going to be waiting through spring through the rainy season to figure this out?
Yeah, I don't see how we can possibly get there without waiting at least through the end of February. I think by mid to late February we'll have an idea of where we've been, and we'll have some forecasts that tell us where we're going. The other question that comes about with California is sort of how the rain falls. So we do need 150%, but we need a lot of that as snowpack so that we can store it in the Sierras and let it melt down. And if you look at the current numbers, we've had a bunch of storms in the last few weeks, and Northern California is actually at about 140% of rainfall for normal this time of year. But as I mentioned, you got to carry that through the whole year. But we're still far below on snowpack, so a lot of it is falling as rain and not snowpack. So I'm hoping that we're going to get a bit more snowpack this year as well, which will be important for balancing the reservoirs and how that water comes down out of the Sierra Nevada mountains.
And is that because the snowpack just melts at a more even pace, so it's easier to use, and if it just falls as rain, some of it ends up out in the ocean, or is there something else magic about snow? No,
it's basically that snowpack is free storage. Yeah, it's because it sits up there and then it melts off. It'll melt and replenish our streams and reservoirs into April, May, and June, where the rain will have shut off by then. So in our state, we've got about 43 million acre-feet of storage in the state, of surface water storage. So an acre-foot of water is an acre of land 1 foot deep, or about 327,000 gallons. So we have about 43 million acre-feet of water, of surface water storage in the state. And we have in normal years, we like to have about 15 million acre-feet of snowpack. So it's really just adding to that storage. It's like a free reservoir up there.
All right. So let's say private individuals who live in an area with drought, what should they be doing in response to this? I've heard things like people in Las Vegas ripping up their lawns and putting xeriscaping in there with cactuses and whatnot, low-flow showerheads, all that stuff. These are all, I presume, necessary steps, but are they sufficient?
I think, well, they're not necessarily going to be sufficient to relieve the drought. They're necessary to get us through the drought. There'll still be, of course, some economic pain and suffering. But it's really, right, looking at 50% or so of residential water use is outside the home, and most of that is basically landscaping. So to the extent that people take out lawns and put in more drought-tolerant or native landscapes, that's very useful. Just managing your systems is very useful. you can still probably drive around on a rainy day in California and find somebody whose sprinklers are on. And, they don't mean to be, wasting water, but sometimes it's just, complicated to figure out how to turn off your automatic sprinklers, things like that. But people need to take the time to learn that and manage their water more carefully.
Excellent. So looking across the rest of the Southwest, there was a lot of drought a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It seems to have alleviated some. When looking at the sort of the Arizona, New Mexico area of things, how do things look there right now?
Well, Arizona and New Mexico, I think, are still experiencing a fair amount of drought, especially New Mexico. They've been in a fairly long-term pattern, longer than California's. Colorado was in more of a drought a few years ago, and they seem to have gotten out of it. They've gotten good snowpack and good rainfall. So they're better off. And again, it comes back to water sources. Arizona, while still being in a drought, taps the Colorado River. New Mexico tends to be more on the Rio Grande River, which has been much lower in recent. So I'd say New Mexico is worse off than Arizona in terms of drought right now.
And I noticed that there were farmers in Kansas, also Oklahoma, sitting on top of the Ogallala that had come to their own sort of, I would call it voluntary or forced water plan, where they realized that they were in danger of really running down that part of the aquifer in their part. Are you familiar at all with what's been going on there?
Not specifically to the Kansas. I mean, the Ogallala aquifer in general is a large aquifer that has been overdrawn for many years now, and we've been looking at sort of what that overdraft is doing to the aquifer. And there's definitely a need to be managing that and other aquifers, across the U.S. and across the world.
All right. So if somebody really wants to follow up on water issues or is listening and happens to be in California, really wants to get involved, what would they do?
Well, the first thing I would recommend is they go and take a look at our Water Institute's website. It's at ucanr.edu/drought, the California Institute for Water Resources. We've got a host of resources on the website, advertising workshops and classes that the university is giving for everybody from residential homeowners in their gardens to almond growers to dairy people. So there's a lot of different resources there. There's also a video series up there of talks that we've recorded on water management issues. We also, our Twitter feed, which is at UCANR Water, keeps up to date on what's going on in the state and informing people about what's going on at the university and across the state.
Well, fantastic. Doug, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll have a link to those particular resources at the bottom of this podcast. So if you look down the bottom of this page, if you're at the Peak Prosperity site, there they are, and you can follow up more there. So, Doug, again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on.